Corporation. I wanted to show this as an example because this is a little bit more mature EDC. It's been around for a while. They took a property that was an old furniture store on the key corner of the downtown, and the EDC actually purchased the property. They purchased the property with some assistance from some state and federal funding. And now the EDC, as the owner, is renting out that property for an incubator facility related to their arts community. They have a juice bar and some other restaurants that are part of that facility. So that's where the EDC has taken the additional step to being property owner and actually having tenants that they help facilitate development as an incubator for eventual existing businesses within the community. And that's a step that Abington could look at as they develop potential EDC and doing something like that in the future. In addition, Lansdowne's very involved in supporting businesses, business events, and communities within Lansdowne, just to support activity and improvement within the borough itself. Now, we wanted to take this one step further in addition to the case studies. So we actually conducted several interviews with EDC staff and board members and EDCs that we were familiar with. And I wanted to share 3 examples of that. The first one I wanted to share was Hanover Economic Development Corporation. Hanover is located in York County. It's near Gettysburg. The reason I wanted to share this example was because it's a fairly new economic development corporation. And the reason why this was started was there was a key building in their community. It was a community theater that was a prominent building in the downtown, and the borough and the community was concerned that the theater was going to be sold, it was going to be destroyed or redeveloped as something that wouldn't be appropriate for the community. So the EDC was established, and it was established with an initial $30,000 from the borough in year 1 and $15,000 in year 2. But what happened with this particular EDC was when the foundational community found out that they were going to establish an EDC to buy the theater property with the 501c3 status of the EDC, they started to receive donations from the foundational community to help with the purchase of the theater project. So that was an initial project that helped kick off their EDC within Hanover. A couple other things to mention. The EDC is now sending out a request for proposals for developers for redevelopment of the theater based on some criteria they have established. And the borough staff work with the EDC in terms of providing staff time, either as a time share of borough staff or as a budget item within the borough itself. So that's an example of a new EDC that's been established. In addition to that, just going back to Discover Haverford, they receive about $75,000 annually. Now it's $105,000. They're working on a self-sufficiency plan in terms of bringing in businesses. So in terms of membership, so that there's less reliance on the township. But as I mentioned, they're involved in activities such as streetscape improvements, facade improvements, and they hope to take on larger capital improvement projects. One of the key things with Haverford that if you were to establish an EDC within Abington is there's a nonprofit source called the Pennsylvania Downtown Center, and they work with townships as well to provide advice for smaller core communities, for villages or communities within a township to help in terms of redevelopment and development within those established core areas. The Downtown Center is also resourced to assist in providing advice for operational and strategic planning. So it's a good resource that a lot of communities use, a lot of EDCs use as something to help their EDCs grow. The other organization that we showed an example from, and I mentioned this is a little bit more mature EDC. Lansdowne was established in 1998. They're now a total standalone organization with 5 to 7 members. They do receive a contribution of $50,000 from Lansdowne Borough. They currently have a $300,000 budget. And part of that, part of the revenue they received is by owning property and renting out space to tenants. I talked about the furniture building. That's what they call their launch box incubator to launch businesses out of that particular building. Their biggest recommendation in terms of an EDC is coming up with a 5-year plan. You should have a 5-year plan to look at operations and key projects as you move ahead with your EDC. One of the key components and considerations with EDCs is the funding strategy. So there's operational funding, which I talked about can be sustained through a municipality. It can be also part of private foundational operational grants, revenue from renting, from properties that are owned by EDC. And so when you look at capital improvement projects, an EDC is a good base for applying for federal, state, and foundational funds. And a lot of times those are projects that can be facade improvement projects. They can be purchase of properties for redevelopment, and they can also look at improvements in aesthetics of properties itself. So the funding strategy is all key in terms of promoting businesses within the township or within the community itself. To take the funding strategy one step further, I wanted to share a couple examples. This is kind of a conceptual example of how an EDC would work in terms of funding. And I'll just go through this a little bit. This would be an example of a property, let's say in a downtown, that would be purchased by an EDC, and how the funding strategy would be put in place. So if you can see on the left-hand side, there's a budget category for the project. The total project is about $4.15 million. And then going left from right, you can see how the EDC can utilize various state and federal funding programs to help complete a $4.175 million project. In this particular example, the EDC township contribution was a total of $25,000 for a $4.1 million project. And what was really nice about this illustrative example is a lot of EDCs can use what's called the Neighborhood Assistance Program. This is a tax credit program through the Pennsylvania Department of Community and Economic Development. And it's a way for private donors to donate money through the 501c3, that is the EDC, and receive anywhere from a 55% to a 75% tax credit on their state taxes. So it's a very powerful tool for community projects. That's one example. I wanted to show another example. This is the city of Williamsport. I know it's a city, but the city of Williamsport has 25,000 people. You have 50. They've utilized their EDC for facade improvement and development in their community. In this particular example, the east side of the community, the EDC in the city wanted to improve. So there was a series of streetscape, street improvements, signal improvements that resulted in an $8.4 million total project. If you go left to right, you had PennDOT funding, multimodal funding from DCD. You also had funding from the Water Authority. And what I like here is the Community Foundation in this particular community contributed $1.1 million. There's a county contribution and a city contribution. So you can see that there was a $261,000 EDC contribution to leverage an $8.4 million project. And so you may say, well, are all projects only going to require a 5 or 10% EDC contribution? And the answer is no. It might be more, it might be less. But what you should do as part of your EDC is to evaluate project opportunity by project opportunity and look at a funding chart like this to see how can we take the total cost of this particular project and break it down by state, federal, foundational funding resource to leverage an EDC resource to help promote and develop a larger project. Okay. One thing I wanted to say in terms of the funding strategy is key in terms of putting the project together. We talked a little bit about operational resources and identifying how EDCs have matured over time to get more of the business community involved. But in terms of the initiation process, the EDC is initiated by ordinance. We've talked a little bit about that here in Abington by the Board of Commissioners. What we have seen across the board is the host municipality, being Abington in this case, provides the initial startup funding and oversight to assist the organization in initial operational costs. But that 5-year plan in terms of operations is key to look at how that changes over time in terms of planning and funding resources. And that's where the EDC then needs to look at over time how you diversify funding streams to sustain operations and grow it into the future. Structure of an EDC, we've talked a little bit about. It's governed by a board of directors. They're nominated by your board of commissioners or municipal elected officials. Obviously, you want an odd number of directors so you can prevent potential tied votes. They have regularly scheduled public meetings, publicly advertised meetings to talk about projects, finances, goals, visions for the future. And as we've seen in our experiences, an EDC will either share staff with its host municipality or over time hire dedicated staff. But usually in initial startup stage, there's a sharing of staff or a provision of staff resources from the host municipality. So with that, we're going to have questions, but I just wanted to mention, as Mr. Manfredi said, that the economic development study, which we're working on, again, what I'm talking about tonight is just one component of the study about the EDC. We're going to incorporate comments from our meeting here tonight and other comments you may have. Our goal is to finalize our draft report April 14th, have a full presentation to the Board of Commissioners May 11th, and then we have a series of tentative dates related to the economic development ordinance. And that's considerment of advertisement June 8th, adoption July 13th, and consideration of appointing of members. So that's a little bit about the process. Now I'll turn it over for questions.
Thank you. I do want to recognize Commissioner Schreiber, who said she was going to be here and is here. So I want to make sure that you recognize the commissioner. Economic development, especially in the Roslyn area, has been extremely important to her. With respect to the questions, we're going to direct questions first to the Delta team. And I would ask, depending upon how many hands we see up, we'll start inside the room. And again, this is meant to be free flowing, so your questions get answered. But I also want you to know that we're going to post what you just saw on the township's website. So if you see things in it that you want to ask questions about, you can communicate those to us after this meeting, and we'll make sure that we populate those and get you those answers as well. So we'll begin with questions in the room, and you can direct them to Darren or his team. If we have a lot of back and forth, I might ask that we try to limit to 1 or 2 questions so that once everyone has had an opportunity, then we can come back for more questions. So with that, Darren. If you have questions, please feel free to go to the microphone.
Yeah.
Okay. Good evening.
Hi.
I'm Gabrielle Soleil. I have a few questions related to just like, they're all sort of connected to like, do we need this or why do we need this? Like, for example, I thought we were going to talk about some specific examples of things here in Abington that you had identified. And I'm wondering like, if those are economically viable projects, why wouldn't a developer just develop it? Like, why do we need this whole public fund goes to the developer and who knows whether it actually works or not, right? Why aren't we asking the private money to take the risk as opposed to the public money? Another sort of example of why do we need this is like all the streetscape and beautification stuff. Again, that's just something the township can just do. Like that's just similarly, that slide that you had with all of the sources of funds, township can just apply for that. Like they could just hire a grants person and just, those are all sources that are available to municipalities as well as EDCs. It's kind of like the same mechanism, right? And the facade improvements are like, again, I'm presuming those are all things that are going on private property. We're taking like EDC money, which is public money, and beautifying private property. Like, why wouldn't the owners just do that? Or why wouldn't so a lot of this stuff just seems like, why do we need this whole mechanism and infrastructure to do what could either be done privately if it was economically feasible to do and made sense, or could be done through like the public funds that are available directly to the township?
Okay, no, those are good questions. The one question about the specific sites, we're going to talk about that May 11th. So we have a series of sites that I'm working with the township administration. They wanted us to look at in terms of potential development. Your questions related to the why. I think it is true that township can take on some of those projects. The one program that is not something you would see go through the township is the Neighborhood Assistance Program Tax Credit Program. So we've seen EDCs use that a lot for development. So it's not that every funding program that's out there can be done by a township. In terms of the private sector, I think if you would talk to any of these communities, whether it's Haverford or Lansdowne, they would say, yes, absolutely, we want the private sector to do development. But sometimes you need a start. You need a key project that's identified in a community that helps kickstart other projects that occur in a community. And so that's where an EDC initiated project can do that to help with those more difficult projects that the private sector may not take on. So that's the strength of what you can utilize with an EDC.
Right, but I mean, presumably the private sector wouldn't take it on because it might not work or it might be too big of a risk. So it just feels like we're just taking that risk and spreading it around like the township instead of where it really belongs, which is with the developer. And the other thing the other question I had, and also you would mention that sharing staff is an option. So again, that's just township staff that could just stay in the township and just do that job from within the township. The other question I had is more about the process. Like, it feels like this is happening. Like there's already like these dates for when all these things are happening. So is this a done deal?
No, it's not a done deal. We still, unless you want to answer that, Richard.
No, please.
Yeah. I mean, it has to go through the Board of Commissioners to initiate the ordinance. So it's not a done deal. I was just showing how it could be relevant to the township if it were to move forward.
Okay, but I mean, there were dates on there for like the ordinance being advertised and being passed and,
Yeah, those were dates that were put forth by the township as a goal.
I know
in
that's
terms
not
of-
your thing,
Yeah,
but,
yeah.
okay, thank you.
Okay. Yep,
Ms. Soleil, the reason those dates are put out there is because we're trying to be transparent that if this continues through each next step,
Yeah.
those would be the dates that it would occur. You're welcome.
Hi, David Judge, I live in Glenside. So you may have already answered this. Is there anything that are there funding sources that being a 501c3 can get that the township can't? Is it just that one state fund that you mentioned?
it's the one state fund in terms of the tax credit program is the one primary example, but as a 501c3, let's say in this example, the EDC can receive private donations, much easier than maybe a township could. So,
And was one of your examples that the EDC was, but is that all tied to that state economic fund? Because you mentioned something about a tax break.
yeah,
Funding funding that particular EDC.
well, the neighborhood assistance program, which I showed, is a tax credit program that helps fund community projects, of which in this case, an EDC would be eligible through an application process to receive
All right.
for projects, not operations.
I think the other thing that I guess I'm thinking more about governance of how this particular committee would run. And what I see in some of the examples are Lansdowne's the most established, you said. And that one said something about very specifically, it doesn't have any overlap with the township or the borough, I think it was, right?
That's correct, yes.
Now, is that, I guess another question, how common is that? Do we want to think about if we establish this, like what our rules are, what our governance is, and what those separations between the EDC and the township should be versus using staff?
Yeah, I think with Lansdowne, it's a separate organization because it's more mature. Usually an EDC gets started within the municipality. It's in itself as part of municipal employees working for it, providing staff time. And then over time, as the EDC matures, it may actually, have its own staff. So in the case of Lansdowne, because they have been established, because they've kind of gone to that next step of maturity, they were able to have their own staff, their own governance. But they still receive support from the borough itself financially.
An annual contribution from the borough?
Yes, yes.
Okay. And then you said best practices are that you establish the EDC and then you immediately start looking at alternate funding sources.
Yes.
I guess the question would be, what kinds of funding sources are out there? What kind of funding sources are common? Do we think we as a township have access to those? Or are those going to be things that are available to us, as we go forward?
Yeah, so with the establishment of an EDC, typically they're relying upon the host municipality to get started. But over time, the types of sources that you look at is many of these organizations will actually get private businesses to provide like an annual contribution as part of their operations. And then there's a benefit there because
Different than like the Chamber of Commerce that's
Yeah.
contributing to.
yes,
Okay.
yes. So the benefit would be then those businesses would maybe be tied into events that the EDC would do or consultation, that could be part of the benefit.
All right. Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you for this opportunity. My name is Joe Rozak, and I live around the corner. I have many questions, but basically two, and I'm going to start out with the first one. What I still don't understand from the questions that were just asked now, what can the Economic Development Corporation do that the Economic Development Committee, made up of 10 members right now, cannot do?
Mhm. Yeah, so your Economic Development Committee, I mean, they can provide a vision like an EDC, they can provide guidance in terms of future projects. What an EDC does, an Economic Development Corporation, is they can actually apply for various sources of funding as a separate entity.
And the committee can't do that.
Well, the committee could,
Then why aren't they?
pardon?
Why aren't they?
Well, the committee could recommend to the township to look at projects.
So I mean, what's the advantage is what I'm asking, and I'm still not clear on that.
Yeah, I think the advantages are you have, with a corporation, you have an entity that is focused on economic development that can secure funding, whether it's tax credit or private foundations, that a committee wouldn't be able to do on its own.
It still doesn't make sense to me, but I'll go on to my next question. I've lived long enough to know that money isn't everything. And I'm sure you're learning that yourselves if you don't know it already. All right, in the past, this corner here of Old York Road and Susquehanna has been mentioned as a possible region for the application of the resources or the abilities of the Economic Development Corporation. Right? As a person who lives here, and the quality of my life depends on what is done with this corner. I have not heard you say anything about quality of life. Money isn't everything. As a matter of fact, money has a potential to corrupt, unfortunately. Right? It brings in more, you're going to get more. And with developers, the idea is to make money. I'm not doing it for my pastime. What are you going to do with someone like me? I border a parking lot that has been a pain for 40 plus years. A small pain, but a big pain in different ways. It depends on how you look at it. It's not a pain for some of the other neighbors. How are you going to consider me when you look at this corner and you want to develop it economically that's going to bring in money for the township and affect me? Where do I stand? What are my options? And I really mean that very seriously. I put in 43 plus years of sweat, blood, and tears to maintain my property. And I do a good job at it. What you do here, give me an example. How would you approach this corner? Let's use that as an example. What would you do? What do you know about this corner? And what would you do and how would you involve the community that lives here?
That's a good question. I mean, I think in terms of this corner, and again, I'm not as familiar with it as you are, obviously. You would want to look at the properties itself, what what the market could be for redevelopment, and also take in consideration the residents that live around there in terms of potential
How would you
reuse.
do it?
Well, you do it through a public process, through a market study, getting your input and others. That's how you would get that information.
But my quality of life, do I count? I know your answer is going to be yes, you do, but how are you going to do it? I don't see it happening. Because whatever happens here is going to make the township look good. The widening of Susquehanna is going to make the township look good, but it's not doing anything for me. It's not doing anything for two businesses that are going to be significantly affected by whatever happens here. From what I know, not much discussion has taken place with them. It's important that you do that and bring us in, have us sit with you. It's not money. Money isn't everything.
Mhm.
I've grown up as a teacher. I've taught all my life. Believe me, money isn't everything.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, thanks
Hi.
for the opportunity. I'm Lisa, and I live in the Meadowbrook section of Abington. This might be too simplified, but the difference between the Economic Development Corporation and the committee is the fact that the corporation can actually buy up properties and the committee cannot. Is that a correct statement?
Yeah, that's correct. And
So
EDC,
the bottom line is the EDC can buy the property and then develop it. But my concern is that, again, and it goes back to Gabriella's point, if we can't get private people now that want to invest and improve these properties, what makes us think the EDC is going to improve these properties and be successful? And if they're not successful, this costs money. Our taxes have gone up over and over and over again every year here. Who has the liability for a failed project? Does that liability come back on the taxpayer? Do the residents of Abington have to pay for the bad business mistakes that may happen by an EDC? Like, I just, and again, I don't understand if you're using the same people to do the work in the township and the EDC to start out with, and I get a startup, I've been in business, then I'm not quite sure what makes us do the leap to go to the EDC unless the township already has its eye on buying specific properties within the township.
Legs asleep, wait for me. How's it going? Good, how you doing?
I'm Reed. I live here in Glenside.
Mhm.
And so I guess my first question was, let me got some notes here. Who sort of originated this process? Does Delta approach the township, or does the township come to Delta? Who's searching for who?
Yeah, so as I mentioned in the calendar outline, we responded to a request for proposals that the township had to look at economic development in the community. And this component of EDC was one component of that.
Appreciate that.
So it was a public RFQ process.
I see. I was part of a meeting, and I guess it was a couple years ago now. And one of the issues I brought up, I read through some of the docs, was just, I do a lot of anti-corruption work
Okay.
at the state level, volunteer work. And I didn't see any protections for, for corruption. And I brought up maybe 10 items or something. I was wondering if anybody's gone back through those meetings, incorporated any of that sort of thing. Issues like, this Lansdowne one that seems to be running on its own now. I don't know what kind of oversight now the township has over that. I know it's kind of the board
Mhm.
maybe has some power over
Yeah.
those people, but what kind of walls are you going to install to guard against corruption? This would be bidding. Obviously you said some private donor money would go in, that those people would not have any influence in what projects were done, that sort of thing.
Yeah, so in terms of the corruption issue, the EDC will be a public entity. They'll have public meetings. They'll be required to have a public bidding process. So from that standpoint, those processes will be there for corruption and anti-corruption, and to follow the state guidelines in terms of the Sunshine Act and those requirements. They'll also be required to, as part of working with the township, submit audited statements and have that oversight, as part of the EDC.
And how about that bidding process? How about that donor process? I'm sorry, is like, it was, people can donate to this, is it 501c3?
Yes.
Can they have any business then with any of these projects? Can they be contractors? Forgive my ignorance. I'm
Yeah.
picturing someone gives money and then they happen to be the person who can do the project in any way.
Yeah, so typically with an EDC, if there's a construction project, it's going to have to be publicly bid.
Mhm.
So you'll need a certain number of bids to get approval, for that process. So whoever is involved in that would have to follow the same bidding process as everyone else.
I see. All right,
Mhm.
so you're sufficiently happy that there's enough walls against corruption to take place in these documents you propose?
Well, I think in terms of an EDC, the rules and the regulations are out there to provide those walls. The action of individuals, I can't control those
Like
or
I
anyone
Google,
else.
that just popped in my head. Has anything come up with any of these other EDCs with corruption that you're familiar with?
I'm not familiar with corruption with any of the other EDCs that.
Issues in that realm for these examples you
No.
used. Okay, I think I had one more, just bear with me. The Lansdowne thing. Yeah, my concern as a citizen basically just comes from two things. One, this was brought up to me by people that are much smarter that can read legal documents and said, it seemed to be like sort of, almost like a copy paste document from other townships. I think the last one was Conshohocken or something like that. So this will be tailored to Abington specifically in your proposal. It's kind of the smell test to me is like, why does this exist? What need is this filling? Who is the constituency? Like, I think on the one call I brought 7 neighbors that heard about this and were like, that doesn't sound great to me.
Mhm.
And these are people that are not super political or active, but there was no one on the call that was in my ward or in my township that was in support of this. So could you answer like who is the constituency for this? Who are in the public is supporting something like this?
I think in terms of, when an EDC gets approved, it's the general support of the public. The commissioners vote to approve it. So it's the governing bodies that would ultimately, approve an organization like that.
Yeah. And I guess my last one, if I have time, that Lansdowne, just to revisit that Lansdowne one, is the board with the township would still have oversight, even though that was a separate entity, or is it now a completely separate entity?
It is, that particular example is a completely separate entity.
So at that point, would that be a possibility with Abington?
You would have to, initially, the way the incorporation would be done for an EDC here, it would be part of the township. So there would have to be a conscious effort, and I'll defer to the attorneys later to separate that into a separate organization down the road.
Okay, I mean, that seems important maybe in the beginning to write that in, that it couldn't be ever done, because everybody maybe has good intentions now, but I don't know who's going to be there in 10 years. So that would be a good example of something to make sure that's written down, that it couldn't be later a separate entity.
Okay.
Using our money. Thanks.
Thank you.
Aaron, thank you. I see one person who was on the screen now in the room. So he'll take your questions. But I want everyone to understand that a lot of these questions go to the heart of what Mr. Nasser and Mr. Tom will be able to answer as it relates to the corporation advantages. And I see them feverishly making notes. So those questions will be answered in addition to what you got. There'll be more. So Mr. Rooney.
Thanks, Mr. Manfredi. I didn't realize this was an in-person meeting, so I watched the presentation at home. And when Ms. Salil got up, I went, I got to get up there. So I raised my hand. I missed a couple of things, but the comments that I have heard from the 3 people were outstanding, and they have the same concerns I have. So I'd like to start off first, and this is actually not a question for you so much as for the setup. And that is, we had several meetings already in person, and there was pretty good attendance. I know some of the people here were at those meetings. There was a whole laundry list of concerns that were brought up, and Commissioner Spiegelman and Commissioner Vahey ran the meetings. And I was quite surprised in the presentation that we didn't at some point address those numerous concerns and complaints that were brought up. We don't really care about Lansdowne or Williamsport or anything. There are 59,000 people in Abington Township. There's nobody that supports an economic development corporation. We already have an economic development committee. And that committee is answerable through our commissioners to all of our citizens at every public meeting. So there was nobody in any of the meetings I went, and only when I see this do I realize that there must have been a meeting or two that I wasn't aware of, which I guess is shame on me, but I tried to stay involved in this. And none of those concerns were brought up. So a short question is, were you presented with those concerns? And the second one is, why weren't they addressed?
Okay, so yes, they were, and yes, they are being addressed. So in those meetings, there were 4 of them, and perhaps you missed it. But in the first slide, they showed all of the sessions where we began in 2019 and where we are today.
I don't mean to interrupt it.
No,
On
So-
the computer, those slides were only the size of one person's little spread.
understand.
So nobody that watched this thing right now could read any of those slides. That's why I had to come here.
So the other thing that I indicated was tomorrow by the close of business, the whole presentation will be online. So you'll be able to see all, but let me answer your questions.
Yeah.
What came out of a lot of those meetings, a lot of the questions that came from those meetings are case studies. Who else have you looked at? Who have you studied? What is the demographics? What is the data? Keep in mind that this is a 2-part presentation. What we are having here this evening is just what was asked for. One of the things that we heard at those meetings was case studies. Show us where this has been, where it has been successful, if it has failed. So that was one of the reasons why they were told to do just that. The other piece is, which you'll see in the entire presentation in May, is they'll get into where in the township they looked. Because if you recall, to Mr. Rozak's point, there was a lot of discussion way back when about Old York and Susquehanna, that specific location. And that was basically, we're not looking to do anything at that site at this time. We're only looking to make the intersection improvements. But if this corporation is in place, and Mr. Nassiter and Mr. Tom will talk about the advantages of a corporation versus the committee. But if that becomes a project in the future, that would be something to be looked at. It's not being looked at now. What we asked this study to do is to tell us what the areas of the township, we showed them and pointed to them the areas of concern that people talked about. But we asked them to tell us, what do you believe based on the demographics and economic data, where should the township put its efforts?
So have they ever gone to an organization and say, we don't recommend an economic development corporation? In all of your hirings?
Yeah, I mean,
You have?
we
You name
looked
one?
at, well, I know usually it's a smaller community, like, I think we talked to Ackland Borough, we've talked to, Upper Allen Township. They just weren't functionally set up to initiate something like that.
Okay, I have a lot of questions, but I'll try and take, so can I ask real quick, how many in-person meetings did you all host? 2 or 3, right? Anybody else remember how many in person?
There were 3 persons going on.
There were at least 2 in person.
Yeah.
And then the rest were online. Okay, I'm just trying to get my, and I'm sorry, I was just trying to get my head straight. Okay, the second one, is there any way that you would have talked or could talk about what the benefits to Abington Township would be between our Economic Development Committee and an Economic Development Corporation? They're going to do that?
Yeah.
Okay. The third one, it seems from the presentation that an EDC is set up to harvest public money to compete with private enterprise. And that's kind of crazy to me. First, I'm the taxpayer, I'm funding a project. And then that's going into some theater somewhere. And then the Economic Development Corporation either operates that theater with my public money in competition with some other theater, or they rent it out to some coffee house. And then maybe, maybe my neighbor wanted to start a coffee house. So how does that either good for Abington Township taxpayers or business owners? I understand how it's good to provide a wall of separation between a difficult decision made by a commissioner and what the Economic Development Corporation does.
So going back to the project examples of public-private funding, the EDCs tend to get involved in projects that the private development community won't take on. It could be a vacant building that's been sitting there for years, and it's an important site or building for a community. So that's where it needs the help of an EDC to come in and look at both public and private funding resources to get a project done. It's not to take over a whole community and do redevelopment. The goal then is if you do a couple of those key buildings that have been vacant for a period of time, then that gets the community interested, the private sector community, in further redevelopment of that area.
Okay, then, this gentleman asked some awesome questions. There'd be a whole lot more credibility as far as objectivity would be concerned if you would talk about some of the failures that have occurred in EDC corporations, because to me, the commissioners have already decided they're going to do this. And this is set up as a sales pitch to try and convince the public that there's some unknown number of people in the public who want an economic development corporation, which there aren't. I actually live here. And then the commissioners have some type of a blockers in front of them to say, look, we went out, we had 5 meetings, we hired a company. They said how great it's going to be. And most everybody supposedly wants this. You know, I would request that the Roslyn commissioner or a commissioner over in Abington would name 25 of their people who have contacted them and said, we want an economic development corporation. So some failures would be good. And I know I'm probably filibustering, but I'm sorry, because this is really important. And it's putting another wall of separation between what citizens can do for input into our community and our commissioners and some 5 or 6 people selected for who knows what process, harvesting hundreds of thousands of dollars, not from somewhere else, making decisions that are in their best interest. And providing the buffer to.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Let me take a shot. I appreciate all your questions.
I'll sit down. Thank you very much for your time.
Not over. I'm David Masters, Michael Tom, we're partners at the Open Law Firm. Thanks for having us tonight. And Darren, thank you for your question. Let me take a shot at trying to answer almost all the questions I wrote down, and I'm sure we'll miss 12 and then we'll jump up and yell, and that's okay. We'll figure this out together. I have 4 children. I'm used to being interrupted, not a problem. So let me try and sort of nail down your comments, sir. The last gentleman, I apologize. I didn't catch your name so much. Thank you, sir. Pleasure. So let me start by saying every community has challenged sites. I'm not aware of any community and anywhere I've heard of it doesn't have challenged sites. Sites are running the challenge of sites that are not economically viable at the moment, that the marketplace, the private sector is not found attractive enough to reinvest and to make it better. Okay. And I know you have some in this community. I'm sure if you're honest with yourself, you'll say, yes, this site's been dark, could be it's being underutilized as a problem. Everybody has them. All right. What does an economic development corporation do? It has it pulls together expertise to tackle the challenge the private sector doesn't have appetite necessarily to take on. That's in a nutshell what it does. What does it do? We talked about, and again, I didn't write down who asked which question. I'm doing my best here. I'm sure you'll jump on me if I missed your question or misstated. Resources. What can it do that an economic development corporation or the township can't do? Certain tax credits, Darren mentioned, absolutely. You can go out for donations. Yes, that's all true. But what it also can do is bring together the best and the brightest of the community that are in that area of expertise, let's say economic development, plus leaders in the community, people that are valued in the community. Everyone in this room has a lot of respect for it. Clergy, other folks in the community that are strong voices, the Chamber of Commerce, the public interest folks, to become part of that board that will have the oversight and the impact to make decisions like that. But then here's the catch, I think hasn't been stressed enough, with all respect to everybody. This is not a lawless group. An economic development corporation is just that, economic development corporation, owned by the township, answering to its parent, the township, appointed board members, in most cases, by the township. And I think one gentleman mentioned how important that was. I agree, by the township. But here's the other point too. Not only is it the oversight that they're responsible for, not only the oversight they're responsible for to this body, but they're also responsible to the rule of law. They don't get a free pass on zoning, since I'll fill out. They don't get a free pass on zoning or land use or any of those other requirements. They have to 100% comply with all those laws. And here's another one. They have public meetings. No backroom discussions, no magic. I mean, there's some innuendo. With all respect, I understand the concern, but they have to have public meetings. They're appointed, they're by the township. They have their public meetings, they discuss projects, they get public input. They have to follow the law. There's no magic about just running through the law. It has to be followed. The next point is dedication. What do I mean by that? Obviously, I mentioned a moment ago, the township will hopefully pick the best and the brightest, the folks that most comprise. Some folks hopefully in this room would be willing to dedicate that time to being involved. But here's the catch. Several folks have said, why can't the township just do it? Here's the catch. The catch is the township has a very long and extensive agenda on almost every meeting. I'm sure you know that because many of you probably come to many meetings. This dedicated economic development corporation will be narrowly focused to economic development or redevelopment opportunities. They will take, again, the best, the brightest, the community invested folks, the folks that hopefully many of you would want to see on a board that was looking to make an impact in the community. And they will dedicate their time at their meetings just to this topic, not to everything else. So it's a much more narrowly tailored, focused exercise. It's not like the township has an hour meeting or has a 10-hour meeting and 9 of those hours are dedicated to those types of projects. You're literally trying to build and bring in the expertise to focus on that. I think it's important not to be overlooked. And I want to stress again, the comment about competition with the private sector. And I apologize as to who said this. I'm sure it's a very well-intended point and I get it. I don't see this as competition. In our experience, it's augmentation. It's augmentation. The private sector tackles, as we all know, the right projects at that moment. Sometimes projects aren't ripe or ready to be tackled by the private sector. So the public sector needs to step in to augment it. Because if it doesn't, we've all seen this happen. That problem, that dark spot in your street starts to suck down other businesses. And the businesses you don't want in your community start to show up. People don't want to come to the neighborhood because it doesn't feel safe. There's problems. This is not unique. This is not a new idea. This is just a way to augment and help the private sector so a community can take an area a spot that isn't working and try and make it work. I think I've covered most of your issues. I'm sure I've missed some, so don't jump up and attack me. Just tell me what you missed. I'll do my best to answer it. But thank you. Certainly.
If you don't mind,
Not at all.
just a quick follow-up.
course.
Thank you very much for answering that. Here's my first question. Okay, just to ask you.
Sure.
So I spent a career as a pilot in the military. When the township manager or the squadron CO brings a lawyer in to explain to me why what I see is right is actually not right, I'm suspect. So I'm not exactly sure in a public meeting with multiple commissioners here, with the township manager here, with a group of experts here, why the lawyer is explaining to me stuff. You don't live in Abington and you don't run an education. So I'm just a little bit hesitant when a lawyer is going to answer my questions because he's going to make the decisions and these people are going to make the decisions, not you guys. And you may be the solicitor for the Economic Development Corporation, but between then and now is me and our tax bills and all of our streets and businesses. So following up on that, we already have an economic development committee. The township guys don't spend their time during the meeting worrying about whether the CVS on Jenkintown Road should be allowed to expand its parking lot or change its lighting. We already have an economic development committee, and that committee is composed of Abington Township residents, okay, who listen to this and make recommendations to our commissioners. When we had these meetings before, there was question to whether the Economic Development Corporation would be solely composed of Abington Township residents. And the answer was no. So we shouldn't suspect right now that it's going to be composed of Abington Township residents. So somebody that's not a resident of Abington Township, those of us who actually live here should go, what the heck is that guy doing on our Economic Development Corporation? He's there for a reason. It's not for Maple Avenue. Okay, so I'm just trying to give you a little pushback on some of the stuff right here.
Again, I have lots of kids.
Public
No problem.
meetings,
Fire away.
That's all sense because our commissioners meet in public and then they vote in public.
I mean,
Dennis and Bones sits up there and they say, anybody have any questions? We talk, and then we answer, and then they go, they have a roll call, yay or nay. Economic Development Corporation is making decisions in public based on people sitting here or watching there. They're making decisions like, it's like this. There's already a plan that says, oh, we're gonna have the vote to approve it is gonna be June 14th or something. I can't remember it now. And narrow focus, that's our Economic Development Committee already. And not that petition, you cannot make the case that isn't the government using taxpayers' money compete. There's a reason why that blighted building isn't fixed. The person who owns it wants more than the people who want to buy it are willing to pay for it. Or nobody's going to invest in Susquehanna Road and right out front here. I'm sorry, I just lose. What is it? Old York Road. Thank you. Because there's so much confusion in the township right now as to what's going to go on there. Who the heck's going to put money into that right now? You could come up 6 months from now and they say, we're going to condemn them all, eminent domain them, and turn them all into open space. Nobody's going to do that. If that wasn't in there right now, we would probably have the development in that spot right now. So I'm sorry, I took too much time, but I want local control by local citizens with our commissioners directly answerable to the citizens. And this corporation doesn't meet any of those.
Thank you. Thank you for your service, brother, of the country.
Can I make a comment?
Sure.
Based on something you said, because something is a law, doesn't mean it will be followed. I have a no left turn sign in front of my house. I've never seen anyone pulled over for making a left-hand turn. It's got to be watched. And I am concerned about the oversight for the Economic Development Corporation, especially if it's a corporation where the people are assigned by the commissioners. You know, just to go back to that stop sign, there was a collision in front of my house. We helped them out. I told the guy, you were not supposed to make a left-hand turn there. He says, yeah, I know, I put the sign up.
Oh, geez. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rozak. One more question, and then we have some online, and then we can come back. Go ahead, David.
I actually, I don't know if I'm necessarily for or against the EDC completely, but I think what I didn't see when we first started talking about it is the oversight, right? And I think that's the responsibility of the township to build it in early, to build in those safeguards against it going a direction we don't want it to go, or mandating a number of individuals that you want, you know, your breakdown of private citizens versus, you know, other entities that want to be on that board. So I just think it's, whatever the result is, that oversight has to be built in. And if it's not built in, then, you know, in whatever draft we're going to see on May 11th, you know, I don't think we can necessarily trust that, yes, we're going to let's approve it and keep working on it. Like, I think you need to get it to the spot you want it to be, and then approve it.
Thank you, David. Let me answer a few of the questions this way. So there seems to be this idea that it's a done deal, yet a question about why are we planning additional public meetings? Well, the reason there's additional public meetings is because this is a different forum. We haven't done this before, an open mic, so to speak, Q&A, where people have an opportunity to come in and ask the questions of the consultants who did the work. And in this case, Mr. Rooney, the reason he's here is he crafted the ordinance. Who better to answer questions about what he wrote than him? So that's why he's here. And the reason you're seeing a calendar is this, again, this is the 5th meeting, which was a meeting that was very important to the commissioners before that we did get answers to the questions about what kind of cases studies did you look at? Who did you look at? Who did you talk to? Those were key component pieces that we built into the RFQ that they had to deal with, which is why they're here to answer those questions this evening. There is a lot of other data that will go into what they will present on the 11th of the full plan, but we wanted to have this piece of it because it is important in advance, well in advance of the May meeting, to give people the opportunity to ask questions about what we have so far. It's not the last step in the process, it's another step in the process. And those other meetings where things that you notice we have it written out, it'll be consider, it's consider. Until such time as it's a motion to, it's consider, which means there's discussion back and forth. So I hope that answers all the questions about why we're approaching this the way we're approaching it. Again, in an effort to be interactive, collaborative, and actually answer your questions. There was no time limit. This wasn't public comment. It is Q&A. So with that, if there's nothing else of the people sitting here, we'll turn to the folks that are online. So the first name, Ross Abel, actually Laura Lehman. Would you please let Ms. Lehman?
Hi, I am stunned at this, and especially Mr. Manfredi, for you to characterize it as transparency, that you have a planned adoption in July with a hearing in June or whatever that was. This is stunning. I mean, you have been told again and again and again that literally, there are not people who are in support of this other than a very small few. And those are the people who are in support of whatever this administration does. So we have a big problem with corruption in this kind of a thing, because we have a township that does not follow the laws. You just recently held an Old York meeting where you withheld the documents and jumped it ahead one whole meeting. That was not legal. That was not
Ms. Lehman, do you have questions regarding the presentations this evening?
the presentation, because the question was, how do we oversee corruption? And the answer seems to be, we just assume that you're not corrupt, and yet constantly you keep proving that that's not the case. So when no one supports it, why do we have the actual dates of an adoption that were given to us at the beginning of this meeting? We're going to be funded by the township and by everything that is our tax money. The grants are our tax money. The $4.1 million that was done in another township is also paid for by these citizens. So these are not free monies. They come from taxes. Grants do. And they literally are shared by everybody. So when you get a big one, you think, isn't that great? I got more than everybody else. But this is not the way this works. What happens is, this is you deciding where my money goes without me having the process that we have set up, which is for you to present a project to our township, for our township people to come to hear the project and to say whether we approve of it or don't approve of it. And if we don't approve of it, we expect you not to do it. But you are, if you recall, the very first presentation of this organization was to distance themselves from the opinion of the public. And that is exactly what is going to happen here, because we will not have a say. It's being done not by our commissioners, who we even can vote out, and you know we don't know how to do that either, okay? But in fact, we don't even have the option of voting these people out. We would have to first vote you out and then have you vote them out. And the chances of doing both of those are non-existent. So what we have is a township that has not been forthcoming. If you look at Susquehanna Road, you told everybody when it first came out that everybody was going to have a say in that. Well, I watched with those residents because I also wanted to have a say. I travel through that intersection literally every day. And I watched those residents that live there literally not have an opportunity to even have an idea of what they would like to see there. And instead, in again, an illegal maneuver, which was brought up at a time without proper notification, you held a zoning meeting. And yes, you actually talked about how it was going to be zoned, how many floors this is going to be. So we didn't have the actual zoning in it, but it was the preamble to the zoning change. And that actually is what we need to be concerned about. You're in charge of the zoning. You're in charge of who is going to be accessing the zoning. You're in charge of whether they're following the law or not following the law. It's your solicitor who says you can do that or you can't do that. And we've watched a few of those things that were not proper either. And literally, we have a huge concern that these things are going to be against our interests. I, for one, consider it theft when you take my money and give it to a developer to do whatever he wants to do and to enrich him. While I have not had a say in saying this is good for me. So the residents in this township are seeing that the Preet building on the parking lot was not good for them. We had a bogus financial thing that somebody tried to make it look good, but it wasn't even true. The numbers weren't true. We have comprehensive plan numbers that aren't true. And so people are being duped. So we have to have trust in the people that are actually leading forward for us if we think that this would be a good thing. This is private sector, and it's the use of public monies to do that. We have people that you want to have from anywhere in the country. I believe, and I didn't just review that part of it today, so I didn't get to that. But at one point, I believe you wanted to have people from anywhere in the country. This is not okay. As Mr. Rooney said, we want our community decided by the people who live here. We want our community to be guided by us and to be done in a way that we know where our monies are going and what they're going to be doing. And this has been the least transparent government we have ever had. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone want to add anything on the corruption question? Is there anything more that we can address that?
I think we've answered that a moment ago by discussing the fact there are laws and laws have to be followed. If they're not being followed, that's why we have police and the district attorney. I mean, I don't know what else to say at this point. So I would just reiterate those previously noted comments. Sure.
Hang on one second. And then there was another question about would the corporation be able to give money to a developer to do whatever they wanted to do without any recourse?
No, the answer is absolutely not. In most of these scenarios, almost all these scenarios, Economic Development Corporation takes title to the property, will often rehab it, will then often sell it and get money back if that's what it so chooses. So it can reuse those monies for more projects to take blight out of the community. In other cases, it never sells it. It could hold on, it could rent it out and again, bring income in that could then be used to help in blighted areas. There's a multitude of aspects, but under no circumstances would things be unaccountable. That's what I was trying to stress earlier. That board is a public board. It does answer to this public body. There's plenty of folks who can ask questions, just like all you folks have been so kind to come out today to ask. It's fully transparent.
I know there's more questions in the room. If we could just, thank you. Ross A.
Hi, Ross Abel. I'm a resident. I had a question regarding some of the examples that you guys looked at. Have you seen any examples where an EDC is being used for transit-oriented development to reflect the town's interest in improving these areas and improving transit access?
Yeah, I can take that. Yes, I have seen communities use their EDC to improve transit access. The project that I showed in Williamsport, key component to the streetscape improvements was better transit access for that part of the community. I've also seen EDCs, economic development corporations that have provided and developed mixed-use projects near a transit stop, whether it's a train stop or a transit stop. So yes, it has been done.
Okay, yeah, that was one of my questions, because like one of the things that came to mind was we had this TOD plan at Noble that's I think 11 years old now, and it had like plans for several phases that were going to happen over the coming years, and like it's still just a bunch of parking lots around and auto dealers around one of our regional rail stations. So that was one of the first things that came to mind. I've talked to a few neighbors who were open to this idea. You know, I broadly agree with the sentiments about ensuring there's proper oversight and making sure it's reflecting the town's and people's interests. But I have spoken with residents who were intrigued by the idea of the town getting improvements that didn't necessarily have to wait for private developers to implement it. In terms of what guides the specific development decisions, would this be guided generally by things like a comp plan or specific plans and studies that the township has undertaken, or like how does and it's fine with me, like I know this is going long, it's fine if this is answered in one of the coming sessions. I just kind of wanted to put it out there, like what guides the strategy of what the EDC targets. So that's just one question. And then one question, if you could answer it, would specifically mobility infrastructure improvements possibly be able to be undertaken by the EDC, like to actually change street configuration, infrastructure improvements like that?
Yeah, in terms of targets related to development, usually what you do is it can come out of a community comprehensive plan. Our work, we've included looking at some sites and potential redevelopment opportunities. And those were sites that we looked at with some of the township's administration's guidance. So yes, it's something that's usually developed out of a plan or strategy. And going forward, I mentioned that some of the EDCs do a 5-year plan, can include plan for operations and also additional projects as you move forward. So that's key in terms of how the strategy is developed for an EDC in terms of properties that are put together. Mobility issues, certainly an EDC can be involved in that in terms of vehicular flow, pedestrian type projects. It can be a component of what may be involved with an overall project. So yes, they can be involved in that as well.
Okay, great. Thank you for your responses.
And Ross, 2 other points to be made. You asked to Mr. Nassiter's point, you know, any work that would have to be done would have to be consistent with the comprehensive plan and would have to be approved and go through the comp plan consistency committee and the board if it's so. And then finally, another group that would be important to an economic development corporation is the vacant property review board, which really spends a lot of time looking at properties that are obviously vacant and how can they bring those properties to being fruitful. So those are 2 other answers to your questions.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. If there is Ms. Lehman, do you have another question or 2? Grace, Ms. Lehman, please.
Me? Yes, I do.
Please go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
So, yeah, the question that I had here, you just talked about the vacant property review board. I'm stunned. You have canceled nearly every single one of those meetings and taken away our voice in saying what's wrong with the vacant property review that we have, which is very, very, very simply, all of our blighted properties are due to one thing, and that is that the code department of Abington Township, under your direction, Mr. Manfredi, has refused to cite the properties for the blighted aspects that they are. And I sat in that time and time again saying, is this according to code? And literally your code director at the time would not answer. He says, well, I don't know. I have to think about it. I have to go look it up. And of course it wasn't according to code. That's why we call it blighted. All of those literal faults of your administration to actually, you are here with these gentlemen instead of using that money to appoint another inspector to actually go after the property code violations that are harming the people at 100 York Apartments and other apartments and other properties in this township. And so for you to call this economic development when what you're doing is taking the money that should be spent on these properties, getting them in shape, they would be fined for every single one of the violations. They wouldn't do it for very long. They would sell the property or they would fix it up. And it's your actual concern that you have not appointed the right people to this job. The last person that you appointed actually had absolutely zero experience. The two people that you've appointed now have full-time jobs, both of them. I'm not sure how that's working out, but I hope you'll be kind enough to answer that question. How they have two full-time jobs and now they are the code directors. Okay, so we have some problems in this township, and that is what I call corruption. Your money is being spent here trying to find ways to take care of the blight when you already have all the tools you need in the property code. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything? Okay, if there is no one else online, we'll return back into the room. There are a few more questions. We will most likely finish with the questions in the room. Ms. Olay? She was first.
So first of all, there's this thing called Google. There are lots of stories out there of EDCs gone horribly wrong. I mean, obviously, and we can easily find those. But what I wanted to say is, just for the record, I'm not against this at all. As a matter of fact, I spent a ridiculous amount of time, I think you know, Mr. Tom, like making suggestions to the bylaws, many of which were adopted, which is awesome. So I think with a few more tweaks, based on what I'm hearing and my concerns, I mean, I really do think, and I'd be happy to, I don't think this is the right forum to do it in, but I mean, what I'm seeing is like, there needs to be absolute transparency in operations and in, you know, the public bid process and everything that happens. There absolutely needs to be a majority of Abington residents on this board, which there currently is not, as the current bylaws are set up. And there has to be an absolute cap on the amount of Abington funds that are ever put into the EDC. And I think that, you know, I'm like a huge proponent. If there's public money out there, like state funds or whatever that we can grab, like we should, of course. But I think we should limit the amount of Abington taxpayer money that goes into this. And I think there's a way to do that. So, I mean, I'd be happy to work with you or whatever needs to be done and I think that the other thing that needs to happen is a really clear explanation, because I think what happened was the initial set of bylaws that were put out there were basically the commissioners appoint a very small number of people that may or may not be from Abington. And then it went into like a black box that we would never hear from again. And I think that created a lot of distrust. And like, that's why we're having all these meetings and all these discussions. And I think that like, what we should do is revise and finalize the bylaws along, you know, these ideas that I'm putting out. And then I think there should be like a way better presentation just of that piece of it. And I think, I mean, I know I'm a lawyer, so I always think that the answer is just like talking about documents, but I think it actually would be really helpful in this instance. And And I also have a question because I'm not an expert in this area, but there's a lot of reference now to the Sunshine Act or the Sunshine Laws in the bylaws. What exactly does that mean in this context? Does that mean all meetings will be advertised? Does it mean all meetings will be held in public? Will they be recorded? Will they be available later? Does that include public bid? Like, if you could just tell us like what that means in plain English, that would be super helpful.
This isn't too loud. It does. I mean, it does mean that they would have to do that. So all the meetings would be advertised in advance. Like, think of it like the commissioners meeting, right? The meetings would be advertised. They'd be open to the public. All deliberation would have to be done in public. So it's not like they can, privately deliberate in the back room and then come out and say, hey, we're doing this. And generally in those executive sessions, the solicitors are there because they say, look, you can or can't do this. So they would be in public. If the township wanted to, they could be recorded and added to the website, so they could be relayed later. So, I compare to what goes on for the commissioner meetings where there is public notice requirements. There are public meeting requirements. I mean, everything you just touched on is how it would have to operate. And to go outside of that would be a violation of the Sunshine Act. And there are penalties for doing so. You want to add? Perfect. And if Rich, could I add one more? To your other point on the bylaws, I do think there was a good consensus on some things that we can add in there to answer some of the questions, whether it's the transparency or the anti-corruption. And we'll work with the commissioners here to try and hopefully tighten that up and get everything to a final form.
And to your point about transparency and moving forward, the reason it's broken up the way it's broken up and we're showing meeting dates out, it's April 3rd. We had this session Q&A to hear all of this, so we can take it all in and build it in. There'll be at least one more meeting on the ordinance, which would be to discuss advertising it. And if that, there would at least be one more meeting to adopt it. So any communications we have in between now and the May meeting, when they present, would be at least June. So we're building in plenty of time. So we're not trying to rush it. We're not trying to hide it. We're not putting it under a mushroom.
I'm just saying, ordinance is like just sort of a document, it's bylaws.
That's right.
But they'll be attached to.
That's right. Exactly.
But they're all part of it.
You're right. And that's why, I mean, and to your point, it is, the ordinance is what it is, right? It just says, hey, we're going to take these steps. The bylaws really outline how it's going to run.
And they're attached.
And they are attached, to Dave's point, they're attached as an exhibit. And I think once we get that next set out, hopefully that gives the clarity that everybody is looking for.
And it will be available, and you certainly can provide additional input.
Yes, I asked if it's available.
It's currently there now.
So dense, like,
Mhm.
it takes a normal person some time to absorb it.
Mhm.
To have it like closer to potentially the day of the meeting, it just doesn't. Sometimes.
The only time we post, just so you understand, the only time we'll post something 24 hours in advance is if there was a change. The law requires us to post 24 hours in advance. Typically, everything's at least 6 days, 7 days. And in the case of all this information, it's already there. This PowerPoint that you're seeing here tonight will be up by the close of business tomorrow, which will be April 4th. So I'm sorry.
Oh, good. Love it all. To hammer the corruption point, and I appreciate all your answers, really good. Proud Abingtonian, I'd like to go above and beyond the standard. One thing that might be a surprise to most people is Pennsylvania is the 5th most corrupt state in the country, where bribery is legal to our legislators. And so that's something I work on a lot. You can look it up. Unfortunately, it's true. And so I'd like to go above and beyond the standard of, we say we're going to follow the law. Our laws stink. It's written into our Constitution. Bribery is baked into it in Pennsylvania. And so in Abington, and this came up in a prior meeting, which I think was for something in Willow Grove, is there was a lawyer there that was kind of asking that I think we have a higher fire rating standard here. I'm a home inspector, and the proposal was to lower that fire rating. Why do we want to go to a lower standard? I would like to be at a higher standard. So as you look into these things, I mean, laws are great, but they're not followed, but the enforceability, and we have a chance to write those things in right now. I mean, you can hear it from everyone, just, it'd be great if we had all those things kind of crossed off. And again, I don't really have one belief, or like, I'm not in favor or against the EDC. Actually go based off of some Cliff's notes that have been given to me, again, by much smarter people that can read through these documents. The corruption part, I think we have a good opportunity to bake that into it above and beyond the standard of what the law is. So we don't retroactively as citizens have to go enforce this thing. Thanks.
It's all right, David. It's been a long time since I've seen you.
That's true. What the current proposal is what, for how much money, how much seed money and year over year contribution? What's the current thought process or proposal?
We're not there yet. We haven't even gotten that far.
Don't we need that in order to inform whether or not we want to do it? I think
I
I think
don't-
it speaks to maybe the idea of like, what is the cap then? Like, how much do we want to get into it? Or question for you guys is specifically, can we build it into the bylaws that there is a review of whether or not the EDC should still exist review that every 4 years, 5 years, whatever makes sense. Like what's the checkpoint back to the commissioners and to the township, not the commissioner, the township, because commissioners may change. Like, how do we keep that pulse on that?
David, there is no better way to address why this is not a fait accompli than that very reason. Again, we went out, the board engaged consultants to do a professional study.
Mhm.
We built in things that came up at those 4 other meetings, as well as other comments. And we're taking this administrative step for this open dialogue Q&A so we can take more and continue to work on that. And there'll be additional public meetings. And I would imagine at some point in time, the Board of Commissioners will address all of this information in their final plan when they finalize the ordinance, when they finalize the bylaws, when they do all of that, if they do all of that, based on the information that's received.
Sure. Maybe I'll ask it more specifically. Is it the ordinance or the bylaws that the township decides how much money to fund at the start and year over year?
Let me jump in, just 'cause I hear your point. I think it's a great question and I thank you for it, but I think maybe Mr. Manfredi's thinking a different spot. The articles and bylaws have nothing to do with the funding, so to speak.
Right.
The
Okay.
township will take at its own time and decide, all right, we're gonna loan X amount of dollars or grant X amount of dollars on generally an annual basis, if it so wishes to do. It'll revisit that because it's not gonna necessarily commit. When we pass an ordinance to create the entity, they're gonna commit $1 billion for the next 5 years. It doesn't work that way. Every year their budget, they can decide whether they want to give 25,000, 0, et cetera, et cetera.
It will depend on how the ordinance is written.
Not how that ordinance is written. It will depend on how, when the township considers its budget every year, how much it wishes to allocate, if anything, to the EDC. So it'd be at that ordinance, if you will, the budget. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and that's where,
Close, but the EDC has to be funded by the township. This proposal is that the EDC is funded by the township as seed money to get it started.
Correct.
And is that in the ordinance?
it's in neither. So that's where there would be a separate ordinance that the commissioners have that they would pass that says, look, we formed the EDC and now based on the plan of the EDC needs whatever, $50,000 to start up. And we as the commissioners are going to pass a separate ordinance that says we approve giving that money to the EDC either as a loan, as Dave said, or as some sort of startup that they're just going to give over.
They can define terms of the loan.
Exactly. And that would come through a subsequent ordinance that the board would review and vote on and, have to pass.
All right, thank you.
And to further answer that question, the reason the timing is such where we're looking at July and August is that's really when we begin to get into the heart of the budget discussions. Okay. I want to thank everyone for coming, for your questions. Again, please, if you have additional questions or comments, please public info at abingtonpa.gov. Please email them. Please let us know. We're happy to answer any additional questions. If you have any comments that we can take and give to our professionals to get answers, we'd be happy to do so. And with that, thank you. We appreciate everyone's time online and in person.
Thank you.
Thank you.